unique experience for me because generally I give lectures on a topic on a weekly basis, but this series is going to be 4 consecutive days. So we're going to be meeting tomorrow and Wednesday and Thursday at 11 a.m. For this 4-week lecture series. But I want you to rest assured that there will be no examination at the end of the 4 days, so you can feel that you can relax and just digest what I will be discussing. And if you have questions, by all means, you can post them on the chat link, and I will be addressing them at the end of the presentation. So I'd like to begin by saying that in addition to the COVID virus, the collapsing economy, the issue of Confederate statues and Black Lives Matter, an issue that is in the forefront of public consciousness is the office of the presidency. Of course, this is an election year, and the upcoming election is less than 4 months away. And another reason for public concern over the office of chief executive is that Donald Trump has certainly been a most unusual president, breaking norm after norm. Just a few months ago, he was impeached over charges that he abused his presidential authority over the Ukraine affair. Over the next 4 days, we will examine the powers that the Constitution granted to the president and how successive presidents from Washington down through Trump have attempted to broaden and exceed that authority. And so this first lecture will explore the invention of the office of chief executive. Now, we tend to take it for granted that the leader of the United States should be the president, but that hasn't always been the case. The framers of the Constitution never intended the chief executive to have powers that would overshadow the other 2 branches of government, as it does today. Even the title of president was not a foregone conclusion. Prior to the writing of the Constitution in 1787, no country had ever conceived of an office of the presidency. Until then, nations were most often ruled by hereditary monarchs, or in the case of Great Britain, prime ministers. So where does the term president come from? Well, it stems from the Latin presidere, which literally means to sit before. It referred to an officer who would sit before a gathering and would serve as the chairman or the foreman. Earlier in European history, it was used in an institutional context. For example, Oxford and Cambridge universities had presidents all the way back to the 15th century. It was also occasionally used for the heads of the colonies, going back to Virginia in 1608, which had a president. In 1774, the presiding officer of the Continental Congress was called president, but it was really a ceremonial title. So the Constitution gave the word president a whole new meaning, as we will see. Now, many in the young United States regarded monarchy as the very worst form of government. The Declaration of Independence specifically cited the British monarch as the source of all problems that was besetting colonial America. The Declaration stated that the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. And so fear of a strong leader remained strong during the decade following independence. The first form of government that was established after the Revolutionary War was called the Articles of Confederation. And it called for a president who would serve merely as a presiding officer with no power whatsoever. But this Articles of Confederation was hardly a government at all. It was really a treaty of alliance among 13 separate states with an extremely weak central government. And it proved unworkable because there was no chief executive to enforce the laws, no courts to interpret the laws. And so here we see this chart of the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. The Congress had no power to tax or to collect taxes, and so the government was always in debt. Congress had no power to regulate foreign trade, and so disputes broke out among states. Congress had no power to enforce the laws. In order to pass a law, 9 of the 13 states had to approve, which made it very difficult. In order to amend the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states had to agree. And most significantly, the government had no executive branch. So there was no effective way to coordinate the work of the government. And there was no national court system. And so this cartoon represents the weakness of this government of the Articles of Confederation as a ship being battered by these forces without a court system, with a very weak Congress, without an effective president. And so because this system was so ineffective, a constitutional convention was called in the summer of 1787 in order to revise these Articles of Confederation. The 55 delegates who met in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention generally agreed that a stronger national government was necessary to replace the Articles of Confederation. The first issue to rouse the delegates was whether there should be one or several executives for the new government. James Wilson from Pennsylvania said that the executive should be a single person. Edmund Randolph of Virginia argued that a single executive would be like a king. And so he proposed a 3-person committee to serve as presidents. It was widely feared that endowing a single individual with enormous power would inevitably result in that person abusing his powers. The lesson that many Americans learned from their experience under British rule was that liberty was threatened by a strong executive. And so in proposing a system of government, the founders were constantly concerned about the abuse of power. James Madison, in particular, knew a lot about human nature, and he wrote in Federalist 51 that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. But most of the 55 delegates were property owners, and they were afraid of popular uprising that might threaten their positions. An uprising such as Shays' Rebellion, which had occurred just a year earlier. And so they thought that a single executive would be able to respond more quickly to social disorder than a committee of 3 executives. And so the convention voted strongly to have just a single president. The next controversy addressed how should this chief executive be chosen? Should the president be chosen by the legislature, by popular vote, or by the states? To let Congress choose the president would give too much power to the legislature, and it would lead to intrigue and conspiracy. And once again, this reflects this fear of the abuse of power. To let state legislatures elect the president would give too much power to the states. To let the people select the chief executive was, as one delegate said, was letting a blind man making a choice of color, because in the 18th century, most people were uneducated and they knew very little of anything outside the affairs of their own state. Given the deficiencies of 18th century communication and transportation, it was almost impossible for any single individual to acquire a national reputation. And so the decision was made that an electoral college should elect the president. And so the answer to the question, how should the chief executive be chosen, was that each state legislature would appoint electors, and those electors would then vote for president. Now, some states said that the people should decide who should be the electors. So some states gave some power to the general public. Other states left it up to the state legislature. Debate then ensued over how long the chief executive should serve. Alexander Hamilton wanted a very powerful president, and he said that the president should be appointed for life, because he knew that the man who was going to be president would be George Washington, and he had full confidence in Washington's ability. But Washington had already refused the opportunity to become king. And so Hamilton was not afraid that he would act like a monarch. But Madison, on the other hand, resisted pressure for a powerful president. And so initially, the delegates wanted a president that would serve a 7-year term. But others argued that the executive should be allowed to run for re-election as a way of keeping a good leader in office. And so reappointment would serve as a reward for good behavior. And as a compromise, it was decided that the president would serve for a 4-year term, but there would be no limits on how many times he could run for re-election after his 4-year term. Now, there was considerable controversy at the convention over what title to bestow on the chief executive of the United States. The title of president seemed too plain as far as senators were concerned. And so they brainstormed a series of alternatives. Among the suggested titles was elective majesty, sacred majesty, elective highness, illustrious highness, serene highness, national executive, supreme executive. Some delegates even suggested his exalted highness, with others chiming in with more democratic forms, such as chief magistrate, or the lengthy His Highness, the President of the United States of America and protector of their liberties. The debate over titles was hardly frivolous, and it went on for several weeks. The controversy explored an important constitutional question. How much like a monarch should the head of the new republic resemble? After all, this was a nation born of revolution against the institution of monarchy. The question of titles was a concern to the founding fathers even outside political office. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution states that no title of nobility should be granted to the President of the United States. Let me just go back to the previous slide. Eventually, the delegates decided on the title of president because they were afraid that anything more would make the chief executive into kind of a monarch. In addressing the fear of a too powerful president, the Constitution agreed that the only way to guarantee the preservation of a republic to prevent tyranny was to divide power into three branches of government. The legislative branch would be empowered to pass laws. The executive branch would be empowered to enforce the laws, and the judicial branch would interpret the laws. And another way the founders tried to check against any excessive abuse of power was through the system of checks and balances. In this system, each branch of government had power to prevent the other branches from gaining too much power. And so Congress had the power to pass laws, but the president could veto legislation. And the judiciary could declare laws unconstitutional. So the separation of powers and checks and balances were two systems to prevent any one person or one group to amass too much power. But there was considerable ambivalence over exactly what powers should be granted to the president. The delegates wanted an executive branch that was strong enough to prevent Congress from dominating the government, but not so strong as to become despotic. They knew that George Washington would wield power responsibly and that he would relinquish it voluntarily. But would his successors relinquish this power voluntarily? Benjamin Franklin cautioned the convention when he said, "The first man put at the helm will be a good one. Nobody knows what sort may come afterwards." Another issue that came up at the Constitution in terms of powers granted to the president was the issue of veto power. James Wilson and Alexander Hamilton wanted the chief executive to have an absolute veto. That is, a president who could veto laws passed by Congress, and Congress would have no say thereafter. But others rose in opposition, remembering how the British king and royal governors would cast absolute vetoes against the acts of colonial legislatures. And once again, compromise saved the day. It was agreed that the president could veto laws passed by Congress, but that Congress could override a presidential veto with a 2/3 vote in each house of Congress. Another issue was who should direct the military. It was agreed that the president shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states, but that Congress should be empowered to raise armies and to declare war. What if there was a foreign invasion when Congress was not in session? The delegates agreed that the executive should have the power to repel attacks, but that he should not have the power to officially declare war. That power would be given to Congress. Another power granted to the president was the power to pardon. Hamilton suggested that the president be granted the power to pardon criminals to make exceptions in favor of unfortunate guilt. In other words, if the president thought that an innocent person was found guilty, the president should have the power to pardon that person. Now, other delegates agreed, but they limited the power to pardon to offenses against the United States. That is, to those who violated federal law rather than state law. Another power granted to the president was the power to make treaties. At the start of the convention, most delegates assumed that the power to make treaties with other countries would be vested in Congress, not in the executive. Alexander Hamilton argued that the executive branch should exercise powers related to foreign governments and should therefore have the power to make treaties with the advice of the Senate. In the end, Hamilton's argument proved the most persuasive. And so the convention agreed that the president would have the power to negotiate treaties, but that the Senate must approve treaties by 2/3 vote. Another power given to the president was the power of appointment. The appointment power was one of the most contentious issues at the Constitutional Convention. Most delegates at first agreed that it was the legislature and not the executive that should have the power to appoint people to non-elective office. Once again, James Wilson and Alexander Hamilton wanted to make the appointment of judges and ambassadors and other government officials up to the president, with no input from Congress. The opposing side compromised, agreeing that judges and ambassadors should be appointed by the president, but would have to be approved by a majority of the Senate, and that the president could fill vacancies while the Senate is in recess. Another power granted to the president was the power to receive ambassadors. Now, it's unclear whether the delegates meant this power to be ceremonial or really substantive. In practice, this gives the president power to determine which governments the United States would recognize diplomatically. So, for example, when the Bolshevik Revolution turned Russia into the Soviet Union, President Woodrow Wilson withdrew American ambassadors, and therefore we withdrew recognition from the Soviet Union. But 14 years later, Franklin Roosevelt appointed an American ambassador to the Soviet Union, and so the United States once again recognized the Soviet Union. Another power granted to the president is advisory legislative powers. The Constitution says that the president shall from time to time give information to the legislature of the state of the Union and to recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall deem necessary and expedient. And so, once a year, the president gives his State of the Union address in which he recommends laws that he thinks Congress should pass. And the president has the power of chief administrator. The Constitution says he shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So these are the basic powers that the Constitution granted to the president. During the course of the convention, the delegates decided to provide for situations in which the executive should be removed from office if he abused his power. Even Hamilton recognized that there was a need to have some check on the powers of the president to prevent a president from becoming a demagogue. And so this is what Hamilton said: when a man unprincipled in private life, desperate in his fortune, bold in his temper, despotic in his ordinary demeanor, known to have scoffed in private at the principles of liberty, when such a man is seen to mount the hobby horse of popularity, to join in the cry of danger to liberty, to take every opportunity of embarrassing the general government and bringing it under suspicion, to flatter and fall in with all the nonsense of the zealots of the day, it may justly be suspected that his object is to throw things into confusion, that he may ride the storm and direct the whirlwind. Now, some people think that this is a very timely comment. Others might disagree with that. But Hamilton was very concerned about a president who would become a despot. And that is why he argued in the Federalist Papers that impeachment should be included in the Constitution. But which body of government should be empowered to remove the president? Some suggested that the Supreme Court should be the final arbiter for the conviction and removal of a president. Hamilton stridently pushed back at that idea. He argued that only senators could be independent enough to thoroughly judge a president, instead of justices who had been appointed by the same president who may be under accusation. The delegates decided that the House of Representatives would have the power to bring charges of impeachment, and that the Senate would have the power to remove a president by a 2/3 vote. They also decided that the grounds for removal would include treason or bribery, but not the vague offense of corruption. George Mason argued that limiting impeachment to treason or bribery would exclude other attempts to subvert the Constitution. So he proposed that maladministration should be added to the list of impeachable actions. Madison objected that maladministration might mean nothing more than unpopularity with Congress. And so he moved to substitute the term high crimes and misdemeanors as grounds for impeachment. And Americans have debated the meaning of high crimes and misdemeanor ever since, because it seems to be a very open-ended phrase. Another issue at the Constitutional Convention had to do with the disability of a president. Although the delegates were deliberate in considering the grounds for presidential impeachment, they were less reflective on what to do if a sitting president, became disabled. And so disability was left undefined in the Constitution, and no process was created either to determine if a president was disabled or how to transfer the powers and duties of a president to a successor in the case of a disability. Instead, the delegates merely named the vice president as the successor of a disabled president. Another issue that came up had to do with the salary of a president. Some argued that Congress should set the salary of the president, but Madison was afraid that it would infringe on the executive's independence, because Congress then could control the president by threatening to raise or lower his compensation. Benjamin Franklin suggested not paying the president at all, because in his view, a salary would wed the love of power to the love of money, and that would lead to corruption. The delegates eventually decided that the president's salary should be independent of Congress, and it added a stipulation that, quote, "The president shall not receive any other emolument from the United States," meaning any other financial gain from being president. Another issue related to the president had to do with qualifications. Who should be qualified to become a president? The delegates decided that the president must be at least 35 years of age, a natural-born citizen, or a citizen at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, and that the president must be a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. They presumed that the minimum age of 35 would foster maturity, and it would give voters a chance to assess the president's political record. The 14-year minimum residency requirement was intended to eliminate British sympathizers who had fled during the American Revolution and who might have wanted to return to become president. The citizenship requirement was intended to eliminate popular foreign military leaders like Baron Frederick von Steuben of Prussia, who had emigrated to the United States during the Revolution. Another issue that came up had to do with the oath of office. Unlike the oath of office for most state governors, the convention barred the imposition of a religious oath on the president or on other officials of the national government. In addition, the Constitution provided that there would be no religious test as a qualification for any public office or public trust. although it would be 172 years before any candidate other than a Protestant would be elected president. Once the Constitution was agreed upon, it had to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. And so there were those who supported ratification. They became known as Federalists, and those who opposed ratification, who were identified as AntiFederalists. They felt that the Constitution had given too much power to the central government at the expense of the states. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of essays called the Federalist Papers to convince the states to adopt the Constitution. Now, the Anti-Federalists attacked the Constitution because they felt it gave too much power to the president, that the president was nothing more than a disguised monarch, and that he would rule the United States much like the British king did. One delegate, Patrick Henry, who had helped to ignite the revolution with his "Give me liberty or give me death," he opposed the proposed Constitution because it gave too much power to the president. He claimed, your president may easily become a king. If your American chief be a man of ambition, how easy it is for him to render himself absolute. The army is in his hands. What have you to oppose this force? What will then become of you and your rights? Will not absolute despotism ensue? Now, the Federalists contrasted the American presidency with the British monarchy. Hamilton argued that in contrast to the British king, who secured his power by inheritance and who served for life, unlike a monarch, the president would be elected for a limited term. Now, the king has an absolute veto on laws passed by Parliament, whereas the president's veto could be overridden by Congress. The British king could both declare war and raise an army and navy, but the president could not declare war and could not raise an army and navy. The British king could not be impeached or removed, whereas the president could. Now, the Federalists argued that the president had limited powers that could be checked by the other two branches of government, whereas the British king had almost unlimited power. The Federalists maintained that the president would be accountable to both the people and to Congress. If he failed to satisfy the people, he would not be reelected. If he committed crimes, he could be impeached by Congress. And so the Constitution was ratified. Now, most delegates to the Constitutional Convention agreed that the greatest power should reside in a representative legislature, a legislature that enacted laws and raised taxes, rather than in an executive who simply administers the laws. So James Madison said in Federalist number 48, the executive magistracy is carefully limited, both in the extent and in the duration of his power. And that is why in the Constitution, Article 1 refers to the legislative branch, because that is the branch that was granted most of the power. In fact, Article 1 is the longest part of the Constitution. It's longer than Articles 2 and 3 combined. Article 1, Section 8 lists 18 specific powers given to Congress. Now, Article 2 refers to the powers given to the president. Now, Trump recently said that Article 2 allows him to do whatever he wants to do, but that is not the case. Article 2 begins with Section 1 that describes how the president is elected. Sorry, let me go back here. Okay, Article 3 refers to the powers of the judiciary. And you can see that there are 7 articles in all. So let's now examine Article 2. Section 1 describes how the president is elected. Section 2 highlights the duties and responsibilities of the president. The president's powers, as listed in the Constitution, pale in comparison to the extensive 18 powers listed in Article 1 given to Congress. And so when you look at the powers of the president in the Constitution, he serves as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He has the right to pardon any person who has committed a federal crime. He has the power to make treaties, but these treaties have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. He has the power to appoint judges, but judges and ambassadors must have the consent of Congress. Article 2, Section 3 requires that the president must deliver a State of the Union address to Congress, that he can receive ambassadors, which is also the power to recognize foreign governments, and that he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This expresses the fundamental mission of the chief executive, to enforce the laws that are passed by Congress. Now, in Article 2, Section 4, it says that the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States can be removed from office by impeachment for treason, bribery, and for other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, once again, this term, high crimes and misdemeanors, is very inexact. Some argue that it means only serious crimes that threaten the security of the nation. Others believe it includes malfeasance in office, such as violating the Emoluments Clause or colluding with a foreign power. That may not be a crime, but does constitute malfeasance in office. Now, although presidential powers are relatively few, they are varied. And so the president is the chief administrator. He has legislative authority by announcing a legislative agenda in the State of the Union address. He can encourage Congress to pass laws. He has military power as the commander-in-chief. He's also the nation's chief diplomat because he can recognize or refuse to recognize countries. And as we will see, he would assume judicial powers as well. While the Constitution provided a broad outline of the powers and duties of the president, it left considerable leeway for individual presidents to shape the executive office. For example, the Constitution left unclear the extent of the powers that were implied by the president's responsibilities in dealing with war and peace and diplomacy. As a result, the Constitution really gave rise to more than 2 centuries of conflict about the proper scope of presidential authority. Today, the powers of the president are vastly greater than anything imagined by the framers of the Constitution. But the expansion of executive power did not come easily. Those opposing a strong executive included influential political leaders such as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And so now we will examine how individual presidents have attempted to expand or contract the powers of the chief executive of the United States. The first president, of course, was George Washington. When he was elected in 1788, he was the only truly national figure at that time, and his election as the first president was never in doubt. He was universally admired, not only for leading his troops the victory in the Revolutionary War, but because after the war, he surrendered his sword and retired to his farm in Mount Vernon, Virginia. To voluntarily walk away from power was something that was unprecedented in the 18th century. It was more common that military heroes would go on to seek political rewards afterwards. But Washington was sincere in his desire to give up power, and the American people responded with respect, admiration, and even with awe of someone who would be willing to relinquish power. Even Britain's King George III was reputed to have said, when he heard Washington's decision to give up power, King George said, quote, "Then he shall be the greatest man in the world." But as president, Washington faced some critical challenges. He was very much aware that every single thing he did would set a precedent that other presidents would follow. He was tasked with building a unified national government in a country that was deeply suspicious of strong central authority, a country in which executive power had been mistrusted for a long time. So as a result, many of the conflicts that arose during Washington's administration and that of his successor, John Adams, involved efforts to make executive power compatible with the idea of Republican government. That is, a government in which power is essentially vested in the people. During Washington's first term, Congress passed laws to establish three major executive departments: Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, and Secretary of War. Washington wanted to appoint the best people possible to serve in those posts, regardless of their politics. And so he appointed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Knox as Secretary of War. Even though Jefferson and Hamilton were from opposing political parties, and they disagreed on everything, Washington was ever mindful of fears that a strong president would tend towards monarchy. And so he was extremely careful not to encroach upon the powers of Congress. And as a result, in his 8 years as president, he vetoed only 2 laws passed by Congress. Oh, by the way, there was a 4th member of his cabinet, John Randolph, who served as Attorney General. So Washington vetoed only 2 laws in his 8 years as president. And he used that veto power only for bills that he thought was unconstitutional, not for laws that he thought represented unwise policy. And because of that, he won the respect of most of the members of Congress. Now, Washington didn't regard himself as the leader of any political party. He felt that the primary duty of the president was simply to execute laws passed by Congress. But disagreement among his advisors forced Washington to take sides. Specifically, Hamilton called for a financial program which included the establishment of a national bank, which included the assumption that the federal government should take over the debts of states and should fund state bonds at par value, and that Congress should have power to impose tariffs and excise taxes, such as taxes on whiskey. Jefferson and his followers were adamantly opposed to Hamilton's financial plan. But Washington favored Hamilton's proposals. And so Washington sided with Hamilton against Jefferson. Another issue that forced Washington to take sides occurred when war broke out between Britain and France in 1793. And that caused further division in Washington's cabinet. Hamilton and his Federalist supporters took the side of England. Even though we fought England in the Revolutionary War, England was the greatest market for American goods. Jefferson and Madison and their fellow Democratic Republicans favored France. They argued that France helped us in the Revolutionary War. And now that France is at war with Great Britain, we should help France. And so President Washington was in a dilemma. He felt if we supported France and went to war with Britain, we might lose that war. We were a very young and weak country at that time. But he was also afraid that if we refused to help France, we would then be violating the treaty we signed with France in 1778. Ultimately, Washington decided that the United States would remain neutral in this war between Britain and France. And so he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality. And that provoked a bitter exchange of views on the executive's proper role in determining foreign policy. Jefferson thought that Washington's unilateral decision to remain neutral was unconstitutional. He said that there was nothing in the Constitution that granted the president power to declare neutrality. In response, Hamilton argued that there was nothing in the Constitution that prevented the president from proclaiming neutrality. In essence, Hamilton claimed the right of the president to conduct foreign policy. So in answer to the question, which branch has the right to conduct foreign policy? Those who said Congress should have the power to conduct foreign policy pointed out that it was the Senate's responsibility to ratify treaties, that Congress had power to raise and maintain an army, that Congress had power to control naturalization and immigration, as well as tariffs, and above all, that Congress had the power to declare war. So people like Jefferson said that Congress had the right to conduct foreign policy. And Madison agreed. He asserted that the president's powers were strictly limited to executing the law and not to conduct foreign policy. But Hamilton retorted that those powers of Congress did not hinder the president's domain in other matters of foreign policy. So, for example, the president had the power to negotiate treaties, to appoint ambassadors, to command the armed forces, to recognize countries. And so Hamilton set forth a theory that delegated primacy in the conduct of foreign policy to the president. But the fact is, the Constitution was really silent on the crucial issues related to foreign policy. The authority to proclaim the United States neutral was basically left open to the president. The debate centered on the larger issue of what were the proper boundaries of executive powers. Was the president limited by the letter of the Constitution? Or could the president act independently and do anything he wanted unless it was specifically prohibited by the Constitution? So this debate really crystallized the differences between Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians. Jeffersonians maintained that the president and the federal government should only have those powers that were explicitly granted to the president in the Constitution. Hamiltonians said that the president should have all powers except those explicitly forbidden to the president. So in essence, Jefferson wanted a very narrow interpretation of the Constitution. Hamilton wanted a very wide interpretation of the Constitution. So this debate over whether the Constitution limits the powers of the president to what is explicitly written in the Constitution, or whether the president has all power except those forbidden in the Constitution, this debate continues into the 21st century. Now, the Constitution did not place any limit on how many times a president could run for re-election. But in 1796, after serving 2 terms as president, Washington decided to step down. He could easily have remained in office had he chosen to do so, because he was so popular. There's no doubt that he would have been elected for a 3rd term. But he was anxious to return to his estate in Mount Vernon. Now, he didn't intend for his voluntary retirement to set a precedent for future presidents, but it did. Every president after George Washington, from 1796 until 1940, respected the 2-term tradition set by Washington. Again, it was not set by law. It was set by tradition. When FDR decided to run for a 3rd term in 1940, that broke the 2-term limit. And then the 22nd Amendment was added to the Constitution during President Truman's term in office that limited the president to only 2 terms. Now, Washington's decision to retire after 2 terms eased Jefferson's concern about a too powerful chief executive. Now, I'm going to end with the presidency of John Adams, the 2nd president of the United States. Adams was convinced that the new American government needed a strong chief executive. He had served as Washington's vice president. And as vice president, he wanted the president to have a royal sounding office, that he should be called His High Mightiness, or His Highness, the President of the United States of America and protector of the rights of the same. John Adams was known to dress in a powdered wig, and he often appeared at ceremonial functions with a sword strapped at his waist. His critics ridiculed him as his rotundity. Even before being elected the 2nd president of the United States, Adams lived under a cloud of suspicion that he really wanted to restore a hereditary monarchy to America, and that should he become president, he would declare himself king for life, and his son, John Quincy, would be his successor. To be fair, Adams had the unenviable task of succeeding Washington, who was an icon to most Americans. Now, when Britain and France was at war, Adams had to deal with the same issue that Washington had to deal with. Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, which lengthened the citizenship residency requirement from 5 years to 14 years. So any immigrant who came to the United States could not become a citizen for 14 years. And the reason that Congress did this is that in 1798, Congress was dominated by the Federalist Party, and immigrants tended to vote for Jefferson's party. And so by lengthening the citizenship requirement, it meant that immigrants would have to wait longer before they could vote. The Alien and Sedition Act also gave the president authority to deport any so-called dangerous foreigner. And it went on to make illegal the printing, writing, or speaking in a scandalous or malicious way against the government. This Alien and Sedition Act was clearly a violation of the First Amendment because it meant that anyone who criticized the president could be imprisoned. Now, the Democratic Republicans regarded this act as an assault on the constitutional protections of freedom of expression. But the Federalists argued that it was necessary because there were pro-French spies in the United States who were inciting popular hostility and undermining confidence in American government. Now, interestingly, the Federalist Congress designed this act to expire on March 3rd, 1801. Why? Because that would be the last day of Adams' term in office. And so, if a Democratic Republican were to win the presidency, they could not use this act against the Federalists because the act would expire when the new president took office. Because of this Alien and Sedition Act, some 25 Democratic Republicans were arrested, and 10 of those 25 were convicted. But the fact is that President Adams did not ask for Congress to pass these acts. On the other hand, he didn't oppose them. But Adams never invoked the Alien Act, which granted the president the right to expel any foreigner he considered dangerous. So the Alien and Sedition Act certainly increased the power of the presidency, although John Adams did not take advantage of those increased powers. Okay, so this concludes the first lecture in the series on presidential powers. In the following 3 lectures, we will examine how specific presidents after John Adams tried to increase their powers. And so now we will